So we'd like to begin by just introducing myself and Leo. We're the co-organizers and the co-conveners of this seminar. I'm Daniel, and I am a PhD student at the University of Oxford, working in classical reception, focusing on the uses of Greco-Roman material by writers and creators who experienced enslavement in the 18th and 19th century in North America and the Caribbean.
Yeah, and I'm Leo. I'm also a PhD student in classical languages and literature at the University of Oxford, and my research focuses on adaptations of Euripides' Medea in South Africa from the colonial to the post-apartheid period. So this similar theme really overlaps with both of our interests. And when we put together the proposal for this idea to the ICS and CRSN, we wanted to present a topic that contributed to the growing, but we think still underrepresented attention drawn to the discipline of classics, entanglement with projects of empire and their legacies. It has, we think, been well established by now that classical education has been central to colonial curricula, and that the classical motifs were, and sometimes still are, weaponized in the justification of acts of imperialism and white supremacy. For our seminar, Out of the Shadows of Empire, we invited scholars from around the world to speak to some of the diverse ways in which subaltern writers and creators have subversively redeployed Greco-Roman culture to critique these systems of empire and Euro-American cultural dominance and to deconstruct the colonial apparatus. With an exciting lineup of speakers in the early and the established stages of their careers, this seminar, we hope, will explore how classical receptions from the Global South have emerged from, in reaction to, and in spite of classics' historic intimacy with the imperial project. Centered on the motif of shadows, we invited speculations on the spectrality and ephemerality of shadowy receptions that are simultaneously intangible yet present. Shadowy receptions may reflect the covert or discrete ways in which writers reimagine, or in the words of Henry Louis Gates, signify Greco-Roman material, that is, the creative expression through detour, appropriation, translation, expropriation, and repetition with difference. How can alternative receptions that have been kept in the shadows of canonical classics offer new ways of seeing and reshape perceptions of the ancient past? How have receptions from the Global South developed not only under the umbra of colonialism, but emerged from, speak out against, and rise above it? So, taking empire as a starting point, we invited considerations of related power imbalances, including but not limited to colonialism, enslavement, apartheid, segregation, westernization, and racialization. We aim to explore contexts both under and after imperialism, if such a thing exists, with a focus on the redeployment of classics as a tool of resistance and reconciliation, and as a process of rewriting the past.
Before turning to the talk, we'd briefly like to discuss a painting which we think encapsulates many of the themes and ideas that will be discussed throughout the seminar series, and I think in particular through today's discussion. And that's a painting which some of you may be familiar with, Harmonia Rosalis's The Birth of a Shun from 2017. In her work, Rosales signifies Sandro Botticelli's Birth of Venus. There's a simultaneous collision of many different cultural impacts: the classical tradition, the Yoruba tradition, Botticelli's work, and also likely the etching famously done by Thomas Stothard in 1801 of the so-called Birth of Sable Venus, among others. The painting repeats some of the key features of the work, foregrounding a goddess emerging from a seashell with other divine figures on either side to narrate a brief episode in a broad mythological tradition. Yet, as with Henry Louis Gates' language, there are signal differences. Rather than Venus center stage, Rosales depicts, as the title suggests, the birth of a Shun. According to tradition, a Shun, an Orisha, a spirit sent to help humans, dared to challenge Olodumare, one of the manifestations of the Yoruba creator god, and in order to do so, transformed into a peacock to fly to heaven and challenge this creator god. However, she unfortunately drifts too close to the sun, and her body and the feathers from her peacock form are burnt and leave her with scars on her skin, similar to the well-known kind of skin condition today, and reimagined for Rosales as the gold adornments we can see along Oshun's body. On the left, dressed in red, Oya, the goddess of winds and storms, supports Obatala in white, the creator of humans. The Orisha of the ocean, Yamaya, identified by her cowrie shells, welcomes her sister to shore. She holds a golden robe decorated with sunflowers, Oshun's color, and floral attributes. There's a central critique of European ideals of beauty right at the heart of the painting, as well as a reclamation of the sea as a place of African imagination rather than oppression. Rosales subverts the Eurocentric perspective to the center of the Yoruba tradition, leaving the Greco-Roman allusions as the metaphorical shadow in the backdrop of the painting. While this was somewhat of a very brief discussion about a work with a considerable amount of profound depth, Leo and I agree the image and its liberatory and subversive qualities offers one such example of the diverse ways subaltern creators could redeploy Greco-Roman classics and material. And this encapsulates the very practice that I think will be discussed throughout the following 6 sessions that we'll have.
Just briefly, before we introduce and hand over to today's speaker, a quick recap that this seminar will follow the Zoom format that most of you are probably by now very familiar with, but we just wanted to quickly run through the house rules for clarification. While our guest speaker is presenting, we ask that everyone else has their microphones on mute, although you may keep your video on if you wish. After the presentation, which will last about 40 minutes, there will be a chance for a Q&A. To ask a question, please use the raise hand function if you wish to ask your question directly, and we'll call on you to speak, or you can type out your question in the chat and we can read it out for you if you prefer. We hope it goes without saying, but we wish to issue a polite reminder to please keep all questions and comments respectful. Any disrespect, insensitivity, or rudeness will not be tolerated. Given the nature of the seminar's theme, it is likely that the conversation will touch on sensitive issues, including, but not limited to, racialization and racism, xenophobia, colonialism, enslavement, apartheid, violence, and/or other forms of discrimination.
And now to introduce today's speaker. Patrice Rankine is a professor in the Department of Classics and the College at the University of Chicago. His acclaimed research profile has addressed many pertinent topics in the study of Greco-Roman classics and their afterlife, particularly in the realm of literature, theatre, and the history and performance of race. Professor Rankine is the author of the award-winning Ulysses in Black, Ralph Ellison, Classicism, and African-American Literature from 2006, which personally for me was a huge inspiration to pursue classical reception research. He's also the author of Aristotle and Black Drama, a theatre of civil disobedience from 2013, and the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Greek Drama in the Americas from 2015, alongside his editors, Catherine Bosher, Fiona McIntosh, and Justine McConnell. His current project, which he'll be discussing a section from today, is Theatre and Crisis, Myth, Memory, and Racial Reckoning, 1964 to 2020, which has just been published as a monograph and is available both for purchase as a hard copy and to download as a free open access resource. We won't say much about this project so as not to spoil anything potentially for Professor Rankine's talk, but like all of his work, this book is incredibly insightful, powerful, and hauntingly relevant. Some of his other research interests, of which there are numerous, include contributions to Queer Euripides and the Critical Ancient World Studies Project, and he will also co-edit a volume on race, racism, and the classics for Transactions of the American Philological Association. In addition to the reception of classics in current times, Professor Rankine is interested in reading literature with the insights gained from various theoretical approaches, such as critical race theory, performance theory, and queer theory, and as we shall see today, postcolonial theory. And we are so thrilled and honored that he agreed to begin our seminar series. So thank you very much. His paper today will discuss the Bacchae and the postcolonial turn, and we can't think of a more perfect way to start this seminar than with the Bacchae and postcolonialism. So please, thank you, Patrice Rankine.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm glad to see so many people in the room. Happy to see familiar faces and also to see some new faces that people I don't know. So I'm glad for the opportunity. I should say this is a very awkward moment in a way for me. I don't know how other people manage this, but it's very different to present a work that is already published or has just been published, but wanting to kind of have people hear about it and think with me about it. So on the one hand, it's a closed work in the sense that I've already worked out some of the problems rather than presenting a paper where one is working out new problems. But at the same time, it gives you an opportunity to reopen the subject to see how people might respond to it or what life it might have once the work is published. So that makes it a little awkward. It's the first presentation in this series. I agreed to go first. So I just want to make sure everyone bears with me, and I will read some portions as I speak about the book and its claims. I won't go over its main claims or all of its claims, but want to talk about the way that it addresses the concerns raised in this series, the idea of the postcolonial and the classics. So I'll read a little bit and want to kind of frame some of the arguments that are pertinent to today's discussion. The first thing, to share my screen. Yeah, and also hoping for more discussion perhaps than even normal, given what I'm trying to do here today. So, you've heard that this book is already published, Theater in Crisis. It just came out last month. And I'm going to start reading about what motivated the book, just to give you a sense of where I was, what I was doing, and why I wrote this book. As the introduction gives you a sense of, it is not necessarily, or the motivations for it are not necessarily topics that we talk about a lot in the classics. Some might think we shouldn't be talking about it, or why are we talking about it? But it is what motivated me. So 2 events from 2020, the year of the novel coronavirus pandemic transformed reality, are corresponding priorities for Theater in Crisis. The first is the May 25th, 2020 killing of George Floyd. Cell phone video recordings of which soon went viral, viewed tens of millions of times by the time of this book's publication. Floyd, a 46-year-old Black man, had been apprehended in Minneapolis, Minnesota, for allegedly passing a counterfeit $2 bill at a local bodega called Cup Foods. My intention in citing the incident is not to retry Floyd's actions that day, his character, or the murder case. Derek Chauvin, the Minneapolis police officer who responded to the call, was found guilty on all 3 charges, for which he was tried and began serving 22 and a half years in prison in 2021. For the purposes of Theater in Crisis, I am interested in the symbolic or the spectacular George Floyd, how the small group of people immediately watching his death made meaning of it, and how the broader audience of the event's broadcast formed a kind of theatrical community. Whether seen with sympathy, disgust, or some other emotion, viewers made Floyd's killing meaningful. And let me just skip ahead to show you this image. There's a great deal to be said about the cultural logic of Floyd's murder, or what the event signaled about the broader public's thoughts and feelings regarding race in the United States and elsewhere. For hundreds and thousands of people who watched, Floyd's suffering became encoded in ways that, upon viewing it or hearing the story retold, led to action. The spectacle and its accompanying narrative, the communities that formed around it, and the subsequent actions of many became a contemporary theater with ritualized responses. The second event from 2020 that is of significance to Theater in Crisis is from the theater proper. In July 2020, 2 months after Floyd's murder, a document began circulating online called "We See You, White American Theater," or it's also known as Principles for Building an Anti-Racist Theater System. The document, signed by more than 300 artists and then endorsed by thousands online, lamented the message that Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or BIPOC, receive in theaters across the United States that, and this is a quote from the document, "This is not your artistic home. This is not your artistic home." For more than a set of complaints, the manifesto included a series of actionable demands, and it's described as having a variety of tones and formatting styles employed to record our many manifold voices and views. A technique, the document states, designed to hold the multiplicity and urgency we lay claim to, given the persistent devaluation of our voices. These demands included symbolic actions, such as American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian tribal land acknowledgements for meetings and productions held at Broadway, Off-Broadway, and the League of Resident Theaters. In addition, the demands extended to calls for fundamental institutional change that impact hiring at every level of the industry of theater, from the costume shop to the leadership and middle management. The document, the BIPOC demands, as I will refer to it, and as it is referred to in popular media, was attuned to the emotional needs of people who serve in the theater, such as the number of hours and workdays they commit to productions. The BIPOC demands, if adopted, as one critic argued, would amount to a sweeping reconstructing of the American theater ecosystem. So we have George Floyd's murder on the one hand, and then we have a theatrical demand, a response inspired by George Floyd, but not directly addressing George Floyd, rather addressing the racial condition in the United States from a broader perspective, and particularly as it pertains to theater. In addition to a chilling spectacle and an attempt to direct the gaze, again, "we see you" is the claim in the document. There is, I would argue, a relationship between an analysant and an analyst to deploy what will be theory and a sort of framework throughout the book, a therapeutic kind of idea that is a patient and a therapist, the patient being American society and the therapist being theater in general, but specifically interventions in the theater, such as the BIPOC demands. So I wanted to just kind of read a little bit there to set up the kind of dialectic that inspired the book. Again, on the one hand, the murder of George Floyd. On the other hand, this dialectic call that the BIPOC demands brought up. And what this did for me was to, if I can back up, I don't know why my screen is frozen. Let me do this and start again. A sense that this has happened before, that if we think back, it prompted for me a sense of James Baldwin's Blues for Mr. Charlie, play that he wrote, inspired by the lynching of Emmett Till, I should say, not inspired, but prompted in a way by the lynching of Emmett Till. So there's an analytics of culture, a cultural event that is the killing of George Floyd, and then the artistic response or the therapeutic intervention in the BIPOC demands, but that this has happened before, that in 1964, James Baldwin writes Blues for Mr. Charlie, a play that revisited the lynching of Emmett Till in 1955. And I wanted to ask, in a way, what were the cultural logics that allowed an image like the one you have in front of you to occur? This is a representation of Emmett Till, as you can imagine, as a sort of crucified Christ, being taken off the cross, his arms outstretched, face resembling almost a Yoruba mask, but that there is a cultural logic that allowed this image to be produced, to be a way in which African-American artist David Driscoll was digesting the lynching of Emmett Till. James Baldwin, 9 years later after the lynching, writes Blues for Mr. Charlie, a play that, again, revisits the event, but it's not a play of classical reception. So on the one side, we have cultural logics and memory. And on the other hand, we have a kind of idea of classical reception. And even as you heard in the introduction, which is often reliant on a sense that a work is directly calling out the classical. That is, it's titled the Bacchae, or it has a title or a theme, even in something like Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, where the Odyssey clearly in its motifs become thematic for the play. And in interviews, Morrison is asked about this after 1977, after the publication of that novel. She's asked about the classical influences and whether she denies, refuses, or engages with the question of the classical underpinnings of her work. We in classics take this as a moment of reception. What Blues showed me, and this is, if we go back to the, actually we can go forward for a moment to, well, actually it's not organized in that way. In the first chapter, the chapter 2, actually, yes, it's circled here, Blues for Mr. Charlie, and I've given talks on this before, but this was not a play that was clearly a play of classical reception. Nothing about it, either in interviews or in the play itself, immediately said that this was a play that we in classics should be thinking about. Nevertheless, what I argue in this chapter is that the play, in fact, is working from a cultural memory of both Shakespeare, in this case, the Macbeth, but also of the Oresteia. And that themes of kinship, punishment, and vengeance on the American stage are at the bottom, at the foundation of James Baldwin's Blues for Mr. Charlie, and that he is calling upon Shakespeare, but also the Oresteia. There are direct call-outs to the Oresteia in that play, and I'm not arguing that today. It's in the book. I've actually presented on this in the lead up to the book and thinking it through. But that this was for me a moment that called into question how we think about reception. There is a collective memory, and within that collective memory, there are cultural logics, as we see in this representation. And artists are embedded in this and draw from this font of cultural logics. So that was one framework that I was thinking through. And as we think about today, moving on to chapter 3, we'll see in a moment that I was interested in other African-American artists that we would not necessarily immediately think about in the context of classical reception. And one that I will spend a little bit of time on today is actually Amiri Baraka, even though the chapter title there shows Soyinka's Bacchae and Tazaki Sange's For Colored Girls Who've Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough. I argue that underpinning this is a work of Amiri Baraka's called The Revolutionary Theater, written in 1965, published in 1965, that actually is a precursor in many ways to the Bacchae. I believe that Soyinka actually read this work. I don't have proof of that, but I believe it's at the bottom of Soyinka's work. And then also Shange, who's also in dialogue with Baraka. So this is the question again of reception versus memory or cultural logics. As we move to today, what I wanted to argue and put forward was the idea, a number of ideas, but the idea that the Bacchae is a play at the foundation of and that is provoked as a cultural memory, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s. This has been argued in some ways. Froma Zeitlin, in her article on the Bacchae, says that this, particularly Richard Schechner's Bacchae, that play was the first moment that we have a kind of modern, 1969, a modern kind of staging of Euripides' Bacchae in the context of the United States. So the Bacchae is a cultural moment in the United States. I'll talk about this image in a moment, but also to think about the US as a post-colonial nation, right? Coming out of a colonial experience. But more importantly, as we move into the mid to late 1900s, the idea that America has become a colonial power from which subalterns and global citizens are seeking to wrench themselves from, or seeking to uproot themselves from, or to throw off as a power. So coming to this chapter 3, coming to the Bacchae, and generally before even the Bacchae, the US is a kind of colonial power. I'm going to just read a little bit from the beginning of chapter 3. I've been calling throughout the book the murder of Emmett Till a lynching, even though the word lynching potentially misidentifies the range and aims of punishments targeting African Americans, precisely because the state routinely allowed extreme and often legal measures of discipline to be executed on them. That is a quote from Jacqueline Goldsby, The Spectacular Secret. Indeed, there was punishment for Emmett because of a perceived slight, but there would be none for his assailants. The state absolved the murderers, Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam, of any wrongdoing, confusing kin relationships with roles of plaintiff and defendant, as we see in the last chapter. And then that was the chapter discussing Blues for Mr. Charlie. As a spectacular or an even spectral practice, the lynching of African Americans affirmed that their marginal status in the United States. In the last chapter, I advanced the idea that Black people in the US have not been treated as kin, although nations are imagined as communities, fabricated ties of blood. In civic terms, Black people are not citizens, and when citizens, not Black. This is an ambivalent bipolar experience, and what has not heretofore been adequately captured in the cultural criticism is the bivalent nature of Blackness in the US. A plagues town, I'm sorry, there's music playing in my building. So I'm working with the idea of the Black subaltern as a kind of inside-outside presence. They are citizens when accepted, when assimilated, and non-citizens are not Black when not. They're insider-outsider, and the sort of best representation of this from the period is Gwendolyn Brooks' Boyd Breaking Glass, a poem that I discussed in the chapter here at the very beginning. Then turning to the image, I say that resident with Boyd Breaking Glass, Bob Thompson's 1964 painting Triumph of Bacchae, which is in front of you, renders the multi-hued collective revelry that inevitably would represent the possibilities for a post-civil rights, post-Bacchus America. As the summary by the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York describes it, the figures ranging from humans to satyrs and nymphs are in flat, bold, unmodulated colors. This is the biblical prophecy, the epiphany that the wolf shall lie down with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. This is Isaiah 11:6. Thompson's is a cultural revolution without arms after Dionysiac miscegenation. I take his painting as a sign of the times, and I use it to encapsulate through image the Bacchic symbolism pervasive in the 1960s and 1970s. And I have to thank Alana Thompson for calling this image to my attention as I was working with Schechner and realizing that Bacchae was already in the culture, was already a memory being evoked in the culture by the 1960s. As a Black artist, Thompson provides an embodiment of the Dionysian age, not broadly discussed in terms of race. So we've talked about the 1960s, from Zeitlin's article, for example, as a kind of beginning of a Dionysiac age in the United States. in terms of the performance of the Bacchae, but it's not been talked about in terms of race in the United States. Schechner, in fact, as Adam Lechner discusses in his book, looks to Asmat myth. He looks elsewhere for his idea of a kind of anthropological equivalent to Bacchae, not internally in the United States. When in fact, it is the Black subaltern in the United States that is Dionysus. He is both within and without, he is homegrown and he is other. So in this chapter, I'm interested in the figure of Dionysus as Epiphany, a religious recurrence that crystallizes the revolutionary potentiality that reached a kind of acme in the 1960s and 1970s. Although the ubiquity of the Greek figure in the 1960s and 70s has been widely discussed, no study considers race or the subaltern figure as Dionysus, although the shift evident in Brooks's and Thompson's art points to the Epiphany's revolutionary potential within the culture. Schechner's Dionysus in '69 was aware of the myth's symbolic significance, but it repressed the real site of revolution in the US, not the sexual revolution, but the revolutionary presence of a Black subaltern spirit. Wole Soyinka's The Bacchae, a Communal Rite sought to address Schechner's racial forgetfulness, and this is Adam's work. It did so, however, from the perspective of Yoruba culture in the post-colonial African setting of Nigeria, although Soyinka was well aware of happenings in the US. Post-colonial perspectives, such as those Soyinka expressed, were available as therapeutic tools within the US through such authors as James Baldwin, Amiri Baraka, and Ntozake Shange. As it pertained to the representation of cultural processes on stage, Soyinka's example of Dionysus as Ogun in Nigeria's cultural transformation was already present in Baraka's insistence upon a revolutionary theater in the US. So again, Baraka is 1965, Soyinka's Bacchae is 1973. If Americans failed properly to diagnose the violence in the streets, Baraka, like Brooks, translated this violence into poetry, and yet his therapeutic intervention was deemed an unwelcome provocation, taken more as the raging of an angry Black man than a Dionysiac visitation, an artistic epiphany that called his theatrical audience into ethical reckoning. There is, of course, every reason to believe that Baraka eschewed European symbols, and I'll show you a little bit of that in a moment, but Dionysus is nevertheless at the core of his revolutionary theater. So here again, revolutionary theater and Baraka in general is not an artist or a poet that we normally discuss in the context of classical reception. And in fact, partially because of his own refusal or rejection of what he sees as European cultural forms. However, if we read his work and think about the 1960s and 70s in the context of on the one hand, a post-colonial American setting, and on the other hand, the prevalence of the Bacchae and Dionysus as a symbol whose memory is evoked in the 1960s and 1970s, then Baraka's work fits squarely in the context of classical reception. Dionysus embodies the imminence of an American cultural revolution, the possibility that disparate and conflicting strands of memory either disappear completely or bind in stronger ways than ever before. The idea of imminence, here again, is the reception model of memory as opposed to looking for a direct reception point of contact. The idea of imminence, ghostly, imagine the Emmett Till as an ever-present cultural form in America. This points to in temporal terms to the time between past and future, a present not static, but full of the potential for transformation, whether destructive or creative. Such imminence conveys well the racial situation in the US during the period. And before I read one more paragraph from this section, I just want to say that one of the motivating factors for the book in the first place was looking at George Floyd's murder in 2020, looking at the theatrical response from the BIPOC demands, and asking, how did this happen? How are we here in 2020? What past has led to this moment? What recurrences can we see in the past in a play like the 1964 Blues for Mr. Charlie? And what kinds of dialogues between culture and theater have occurred prior to this, leading to this moment of what was called in 2020 racial reckoning? I can give you examples of the US as a post-colonial nation. I do want to give you a sense of that. I think Justine McConnell is on the line, but her work on gospel at Colonus is probably one of the first places now, almost 10 years ago, where I saw a scholar really kind of digging into thinking through the possibility of the United States as a post-colonial country, that the tropes of post-coloniality, the presence of a subaltern culture, all point to a kind of post-colonial reality in the United States where we really don't usually discuss culture in terms of colonialism and post-colonialism, at least not in the modern period of the late 20th century into the contemporary period. Just quickly finding a couple of paragraphs for us to read regarding the post-colonial setting, and then giving you a bit of Baraka before opening it up for us to talk a little bit. And sorry again about the interruption. Let's see. So internationally, the 1960s and 1970s marked the height of regime change across Africa and Asia, what historians periodize as a post-colonial era or an era of decolonialization. Already in the 1950s, James Baldwin was speculating about the lessons from these events for the United States. One of his clearest inscriptions of the US as a Western colonial power came in Princes and Powers, his report from the September 1956 conference of Negro African writers and artists at the Sorbonne in Paris. In his essay, Baldwin aligns the plight of Black Americans with these international struggles. First, one idea, he argues, unified the conference participants, notwithstanding the array of cultural differences and national situations they represented, which included delegates as diverse as Aimé Césaire, Leopold Senghor, a Haitian nationalist, an African Christian, and Richard Wright, the American atheist living abroad. This one idea was race. They were Black, and as such, they shared what Baldwin called the fact of their subjugation to Europe. Black people in the US, however, were in a paradoxical situation, given their uncomfortable awareness of their national status, the inconceivability of their liberation from the nation to which they belonged. Black people in the US had no national language of their own, for the most part, whatever their vernacular inflections existed. What constitutes a people where there are no distinct ethnicities and no land? Baldwin's answer is cultural, not military. He recognizes that whatever their potential relationship to nation, Black people globally were debating questions of religion, tradition, and imperialism, as Richard Wright put it in his address. Through colonialism, European powers, which now included the US and Russia in their struggle for world domination in Vietnam, for example, had remade all African people, indeed the entire global South. All were related to Europe, in Baldwin's words, related to Europe. So the traditions of African people now melded with those of Europe. Because of the double-edgedness of this reality, politics, as George Lamming saw it, had become the only common ground for Black people across the diaspora, an arena of pragmatic civics and economic gains alongside the expansion of private lives and indulgences. Politics, however, obscured the Dionysiac possibilities of a deeper unconscious resistance, the unwillingness to settle on politics, political and economic compromises. Dionysus might stand in for the unconscious desire repressed for the sake of politics and economics. And this repressed desire in the form of Dionysus was certainly present. So let me turn quickly to Bacchae before I turn over and allow us to have a little bit of a conversation about this. Again, Bacchae is not the kind of writer that we have traditionally talked about in the context of classical reception. In fact, he wouldn't have wanted us to. He attended Rutgers in 1951, Howard University in 1952, studied at Columbia. He was numbered among the Beat poets, Allen Ginsberg and so on. He traveled with these poets. But by 1965, changes his name from Leroy Jones, divorces his Jewish white wife at the time, and is transformed in part, as he sees it, because of the assassination of Malcolm X. So he's understood to be a founder of the Black Arts movement. And an example of the way that this movement has taken reception and Black artist engagement with classical reception. This is Tracy Walters talking, in fact, about Gwendolyn Brooks. And she argues that artists of the Black arts movement began focusing on art that divorced itself from European models and embraced an Afrocentric aesthetics. Larry Neal, for example, proposed that Black artists should reject white ideas and white ways of looking at the world and create a separate symbolism, mythology, critique, and iconology. Unfortunately, writers like Neal forgot that classics were part of an African aesthetics from its origins in Terence. So the three works that I'm interested in the book are one play, The Dutchman, a 1964 play, a work from 1965 called The System of Dante's Hell, which is a kind of autobiography or memoir in poetic form. But here is where we begin to see signs of Dionysus. I'm going to give you a little bit of that in a moment. And then The Revolutionary Theater in 1965, which becomes a track in dialogue with the cultural logics of the time, similar to the BIPOC movement, and prior to that, similar to James Baldwin's response to the lynching of Emmett Till. And I want to be conscious of time and not read too much more, but let me just give you a sense of Bacchae. Bacchae had been counted among the Beat poets until his split with the group and initiation of the Black Arts movement, where, as one author put it, he rose from the ashes of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. In 1965, even before King's assassination, and a year after Baldwin's Blues opened in New York City, Bacchae published The Revolutionary Theater. This is, in my reading, a Dionysiac therapeutic intervention in the US that anticipates both Schechner and Soyinka. The editors of the New York Times, where Bacchae had originally sent the essay, claimed that they could not understand it and therefore did not publish it. Even the Village Voice, a countercultural alternative weekly newspaper that was a decade old at the time, refused to run The Revolutionary Theater. Like Baldwin's observations, the manifesto was meant for white audiences, and Bacchae held nothing back. Although Bacchae preceded Schechner and Soyinka with this publication, there is compelling reason to believe that Dionysus was at the heart of Bacchae's message as an epiphanic projection that captured the spirit of the decade. His work of the same period, The Revolutionary Theater, The System of Dante's Hell, figures a protagonist akin to Nietzsche's Dionysus. So same year published, and one author sees Bacchae's novella, this little autobiographical work, where the main character is Roy, think of Leroy. He sees Baraka's Black prototype as a Dionysian hero, a hero born out of primal instincts and urges, orgiastic rites, and drunken frenzy. He is molded out of the Dionysian myth of suffering and death, of being constantly sundered from himself. So like the system of Dante's hell, in the revolutionary theater, Baraka never directly names the European specter of Dionysus, but his Bacchic groping, a word that Soyinka will come to use, of a groping for ritual significance when he critiques Dionysus in 69, Soyinka's Bacchic groping anticipates the language of Schechner and Soyinka. On its surface, Baraka seems to uproot himself from the European cultural soil in which he grew. He changes his name, as we've discussed, from Leroy Jones to Mary Baraka, divorces his white wife, and quite literally dons African garb. Although his Black arts framework would be threatening to established American norms and would seem apart from the mainstream, it drew from the self-same symbols of the Europe from which he sought to distance himself. The characteristics of the Beat Generation poetry were Bacchic. These include sexuality, psychedelic drugs, and a merging of Eastern and Western forms, all of which would come to realization in Schechner. In System of Dante's Hell, Baraka is obsessed with sexuality as well, and yet the miscegenation and homosexual anxiety that permeates the novella stays at home, as it were, in the US, in New Jersey, unlike Schechner's Dionysus in 69. That is, Baraka's foci are domestic, beginning in his hometown of New York, New Jersey, and never straying from the American soil, although Dante, Odysseus, and other European ghosts also haunt that work. I'm just going to read one more paragraph or so, just to give you a sense of the revolutionary theater. Throughout that work, Baraka dances between the idea of revolution as a cultural, metaphorical mode and the revolution of theater as violent and real. The treatise arrests time. Throughout the piece, the repetition of the revolutionary theater at the beginning of most sentences, replaced at times by it or this, reverberates with Gil Scott-Heron's 1970 recording, "The revolution will not be televised," where even there also, the revolution will not be televised. Baraka seeks an onstage hero who demonstrates, as he puts it, not a sad, sentimental groping for a warmth in our despair. Just as Gil Scott-Heron's poem will later echo Baraka's words, Baraka anticipates Soyinka's notion of groping the warmth in our despair, evincing the corporal groping for the ritual experience, as Soyinka will put it in the fourth stage, a groping for the ritual experience. Declaring what the revolutionary theater is, should, or must do, Baraka rhythmically seeks to force change. The revolutionary theater, he says, should be changed. Baraka calls for the revolutionary theater to, quote, cleanse them, white American theater goers, at having seen the ugliness, unquote. He seeks to replace the sad, sentimental groping of white American theater goers with a kind of Aristotelian catharsis, which echoes Baldwin's call for white self-realization. The terror for which Baldwin calls is that of a beheaded Pentheus. As Baraka now puts it, quote, white men will cower before this theater because it hates them, unquote. So again, this sounds really shocking and really, he says in one interview, and I have some quotes for you in a second, he says that he wants to burn the White House down, right? And all of this sounds very radical and very revolutionary and very anti-white, but in fact, it's Bacchic. In fact, it's Dionysus he's drawing on. It's Nietzsche he's drawing on. In Bacchic fashion, Baraka wants to set the stage for Pentheus's reckoning and the culture or Agave's recognition. This requires the contemplation of harsh realities, the beholding of a dismembered Pentheus. These harsh realities, however, the truth behind the veneer of civic society, and Dionysus identifies as this truth in that he too was dismembered. So these realities are, however, the truth behind the veneer of civic society. I've been going on now for about 45 minutes. Let me just leave you with a quote or two that gives us a sense of Baraka's postcolonial vision. Someone asks him, I'm wondering about this, can Black Americans break free from white colonial mentality short of establishing almost a separate nation of some kind? Jones says, we are a separate nation. It's just that we are a nation in captivity. This is in 1965. We are an oppressed people, a captive people, and we are a nation. We are a large group of people with what amounts to separate culture in our most intimate, most profound ways, expressing ourselves. Just one other quick example. He says a lot of Black people are schizophrenic like that. They'll be talking about Black politics, getting a nation, even nationalists, and really all the time, they will be connecting up with white culture. So this is an example of the kind of split he makes between Black and white. They will still be digging Mozart more than James Brown. All that shit, Mozart, Beethoven, all of it. If it has to be burned now for the liberation of our people, it should be burned up the next minute. Again, this sounds like very big talk, but it really is in keeping with the symbolism, and particularly the Nietzschean symbolism that he's interested in and working with during this period. Sorry again about the kind of strange disruption with the music blaring in the background. I will stop there and see if we can, through conversation, make a little bit more sense of what I'm saying.